Welcome to the San Ramon Valley Democratic Club. My name is Brody Hill. I serve as president. Rick Adler, our vice president, is here, as well as our board member, Cecilia Manalga, our Zoom administrator, and Brian Lauber, our treasurer. We're glad you joined us. I just have 3 quick announcements. 2 of the events are tomorrow. First, Congressman Eric Swalwell has made an HBO movie about the January 6th insurrection. Tomorrow morning, you can watch his interview with police officer Ferone. Second, also on Friday, Youth Apocalypse and Bay Area 350 are having a rally and march in San Francisco at 10 o'clock a.m. in front of the BlackRock Financial Office. It's going to commemorate the Global Day of Action to defund fossil fuels. And third, there are only 5 days left to make phone calls into Virginia to turn out the Democrats to vote. These are easy phone calls. Again, we're just trying to get out the vote. See chat for more details on all 3 of these events. Tonight, we're discussing housing justice. I chose this topic in September, and since then, there have been many articles in newspapers, some with huge headlines about housing. And we're so happy to have 4 speakers to give us ideas about the key issues and how to become involved. Our first speaker is Dr. Margaretta Wan-Ling. She is our motivation speaker. She's had many experiences fighting for justice. Currently, she is a lecturer at the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. She also serves as the founding director of Just Cities, a policy justice organization. To hear about what Margaretta has accomplished, our board members will ask her questions about her experiences. Margaretta, are you here?
Yes, I am here. And
hi, thank you.
I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, good. Thank you. And Brian Lauber, are you here?
I am.
Oh, great. Okay, our first question will be presented by our treasurer and board member, Brian Lauber, who has worked at the Lawrence Livermore Labs for 43 years and who attended UC Berkeley as an undergraduate student. Brian.
I'll correct one thing. I was in graduate school.
Oh, graduate
undergrad.
School. Sorry. Okay.
My first political activism was to register students at Sproul Plaza for Ron Dellum's first campaign for Congress in 1970. As a senior advisor to the mayor, is there an interaction with Mayor Dellum's that you can share with us that as a reminder of why many of us developed our progressive activism?
Thank you, Brian, so much for that question. And I want to first just thank you, Brody, and thank you to this amazing club for your existence. I love speaking with resident associations, right? You all are part of the core fabric of democracy in our nation. And I love being asked about my dear mentor and friend and former boss, our former congressman, Oakland Mayor, Berkeley City Council member, Ronald V. Dellums. I have so many stories about Ron, but for the sake of time, I'll just share one story about Ron that exemplifies his just quintessential fearlessness and courage, integrity, and love for human beings. This was shortly after Oscar Grant was killed at the Fruitvale BART station in 2009. And this was shortly before I was about to start working for the Dellums administration when Ron was mayor of Oakland. And I was asked by community activists who are organizing a protest demonstration seeking justice for Oscar Grant to participate as a legal observer. So I am also a human rights lawyer. So I was at City Hall that night, and Ron was walking out of City Hall with a group of city leaders, several council members, to just be out in the community to find out, to listen to people basically. And so I joined him on that walk, and things got very heated and contentious. And even though it was the BART police who shot Oscar Grant, and a altogether different jurisdiction from the city of Oakland, most people don't understand those fine distinctions between different public agencies. And people saw Ron as the mayor, as the man in that instant, right? The person for them to really unleash their anger and their deep, deep pain and suffering. And Ron, as many people, as you may know, was a social worker, and he got his master's in social work from UC Berkeley. In times of crisis, I just saw him, that old social worker, kick in. And he would stop and talk to every person who was in pain. However, word got out that the mayor was in the streets, and people started, just more and more people started coming. And there was a lot of anger. And that anger that energy anger was really intense and strong. And it felt like anything could happen to set off violence. The Oakland police came, but their presence started, made people more agitated, and Ron sent the police away. Several of the council members who had started that walk with Ron had left when things got really intense. And only one of the council members stood around, Council Member Larry Reed. But just watching Ron in action, he was fearless. And he just was he centered his love for people who were in pain. And people were calling him really nasty names. They were like up to his face like that, and just, being incredibly disrespectful. But he just he took it, he understood that they were in pain and didn't take it personally. That next morning, Ron had a private meeting with the DA at the time, and was able to get the Alameda County DA to take the very unprecedented action of charging a police officer. And it was, and then he allowed Thomas Orloff to be the person at the press conference to make that announcement, when most other politicians would take credit for what they did behind closed doors. Ron was not that kind of person, right? He cared more about the results. He wasn't about his ego and needing that public recognition. He cared about people, and he cared about results. Thank you, Brian, so very much for that question.
Thank you.
That was very inspiring. I think Vice President Rick Adler will give the next question.
Yeah, I'm very glad that you're here with us tonight, Dr. Lynn. Like Brian, I also went to Cal, and I was an undergrad, so I wasn't quite as mature as he was when he was. But I did enjoy always walking through Sproul Plaza and seeing what was happening. There was always a speaker or somebody handing out leaflets, so it was kind of the center of activism when I was at school there. My question is, since we're living through a global pandemic, and you served as the director of federal stimulus, the program for the city of Oakland during the Great Recession, what does it take, in your estimation, to organize people within the government bureaucracy to respond quickly and effectively to big scale emergencies?
Thank you so much, Rick, for that question. So I was an accidental government leader. I had spent my career before going into the city of Oakland as the outside agitator, organizer, and lawyer. And people in Oakland City Hall knew me for threatening to sue them for violating people's civil and human rights. But going in the inside and working for Ron Dellums was just a transformative experience for me, because government first is the only place in our society that has the responsibility to care about the most vulnerable amongst us, right? There's no other sector that holds that responsibility. So it's so important that we have the best and brightest to go on the inside of government agencies. And that's why I'm back teaching at UC Berkeley, both undergrads and graduate students, to try to inspire the next generation of government leaders. Government has been defunded, right, under neoliberalism. So we've had so many decades of fulfilling this neoliberal narrative about government as being incompetent, as not caring. During the Great Recession, we lost 1,000 city staff people in one fell swoop like that, 1,000, right? Yet we were still expected to provide the same type and same level of public services. So I got to witness day in, day out, amazing public servants at all levels of government. However, the bureaucracy is incredibly disorganized. So what did it take for us to bring people together under one vehicle, one Oakland, one plan to survive the Great Recession? Number one, it took really strong and principled and visionary political leadership. And I'm so grateful because we had that with Ron Dellums. It also took a strong organizational structure to herd many, many cats. There are a lot of cats in politics and government. You've got your political cats, you have your bureaucratic cats, you have your community cats, you have all these public agencies, right? And everyone is very used to doing their own thing and having their own turf and not necessarily working well together. So you need great organizers. And it really helped me that I had an organizing background. And I was able to put in those systems to enable people to then show up in their best selves. And the third thing is, so many people go into government because they love humanity and they're motivated by public service. But the systems we have set up And the disinvestment in our public agencies has really resulted in organizational structures that are very dysfunctional and that also don't value the brilliance of the workforce. And so I was able to, the way that Ron gave me permission to think big, I was able to give that permission in turn to really amazing public servants, and they rose to the occasion. People worked night and day to put in these amazing grants in order to keep the lights on in Head Start centers, to create new innovation around greening our cities while providing for jobs for low-income residents, for the reentry population, for our young people. So I was very inspired and transformed by that experience, and ended up becoming the deputy city administrator and stayed in the city of Oakland for almost 7 years.
Thank you. Another question here. What drew you into housing work, and what was the Oakland Chinatown Pacific Renaissance housing justice struggle? Were there similar struggles in other cities, or was this specific to Oakland?
Thank you, Brody, for that question. Feel like after graduating from law schools, everything I've done in life has been just like one big accident. Working inside of government was an accident. Getting involved in housing was also an accident. So I had just started working at the East Bay Community Law Center, which was started by a handful of Berkeley law students who believed that the law school and law students had a duty to the community. Today, it is 30 years later, it's the largest legal services provider in the entire East Bay. So talk about inspiration, right? I 2 months into my new position at the East Bay Community Law Center, where I was not working on housing, I was asked to go to a community meeting in Oakland Chinatown because all the tenants, 50 families living in the heart of Chinatown in what they believed was affordable housing, all received eviction notices at once. So they needed someone to go to the meeting. It was during the weekend. I showed up. And these tenants were all low-income, elderly immigrants, most of whom were monolingual, not English speaking. And they were terrified. They were terrified of losing their homes. They were terrified of not having alternative housing. And they were terrified of the great unknown. So despite never having worked in housing, I stood up and made a commitment to the tenants that if they were willing to fight for their rights, that I would do what I could to bring people together to support them. And through that struggle, I learned so much. I learned about before then, my work had been mainly on education issues. I learned about the political corruption in City Hall. And when I say political corruption, I mean that from kind of definition that Gandhi would use, right? So I'm not sure if monies exchanged hands. But private developers during that time period they controlled City Hall. The elected officials, for the most part, were not about the people. They were about their cronies who were private developers. Jerry Brown was mayor at the time, and his vision of Oakland was to make Oakland safe for tech workers from San Francisco. And he had launched what he called his 10K plan to bring 10,000 great people to Oakland. You wonder, as an aside, why someone would run for mayor of a city if he didn't think that there were great people residing in that city already. But we'll just leave that for now. The City Hall response to the eviction notices was that the developer was a great guy. Well, of course, because it turned out, and we did discovery requests and FOIA and public records requests, and as part of the litigation, discovered a lot of information, including that the developer, who was part of a family that was one of the 10 wealthiest families in Hong Kong, would take our elected officials on these paid excursions to Hong Kong, right? And I'm sure, he was a major political donor to their campaigns as well. So we had to organize. And there were some really amazing grassroots organizations like Asian Pacific Environmental Network and Causa Justa Just Cause, who supported the tenants. We had to get media attention involved, and we had to threaten litigation to get the city to side with us. And we sued the developer, the landlord. The city only sided with us because we forced them to. And, but they undermined our joint litigation in so many different ways. During this time period, a number of the elderly tenants, they passed away from the stress of living under the threat of possibly losing their homes. And I saw firsthand the direct connections between health and stable housing, right? Dr. Mindy Fulalove from Columbia University talks about this. She coined this term called root shock, that when vulnerable people are removed or displaced from the things that make them feel rooted and whole and seen and valued as a human being, they go into shock. And sometimes it results in health impacts, and with some of these vulnerable elders, sometimes even death, early death. Things changed when Ron became mayor of Oakland. And so when he was mayor, the city was completely on our side and on the side of the elders, on the side of the people. And we were able to get to a win-win settlement agreement that kept that housing for the Chinatown community, that added more monies to build new affordable housing in Chinatown, and allowed the developer to save face as well. And so that's how I got my start on housing justice, and it's been a big passion of mine since then.
Thank you. Rick, do you have the next question?
Yes, I do. In line with the continuing discussion about the ongoing housing crisis, you wrote an article a few years ago in the Berkeley Planning Journal about common sense solutions to the California housing crisis. Can you please share with us some of your top line ideas?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you, Rick, for that question. I think the starting place is really how we view housing, right? So currently, housing is seen as a commodity, similar to our car. It's something like we buy, it's a thing. And from my perspective, that makes no sense because we all need housing in order to survive as human beings, right? So what would the state of California or nation or world look like if we viewed housing instead, just shifted our framework, our mindset, and thought of housing as something essential to societal and public good, the way we think of public education, the way we think of milk. It's something that's critical to the health and well-being of our children, of our families, our communities, of our society, right? I think that starting place is that paradigm shift. Second, I think it's yes to building more housing. However, it's not just about building, and we can never build our way out of California's housing crisis. We have to look at affordability issues. And are we building the kind of housing that the people in those areas can actually afford? And what we see instead is a tremendous mismatch between the type of housing that gets built and what people who are in desperate straits can actually afford in that local community, right? Oakland's a great example of that, of doing a great job of actually overbuilding the regional allocation requirement of market rate housing, but completely underperforming in terms of housing affordable to low-income residents. This is a major reason why we have an explosion in homelessness. It's affordability. And in fact, a few years ago, we did a participatory research project interviewing 100 unhoused residents in Oakland's encampments. And through listening to their stories, we discovered that the majority of the people we interviewed had been housed within the past year. They were housed, they were working, and then they lost their housing, right? So I know today we're not talking about homelessness. I hope you invite me back when you do talk about homelessness, because there are a lot of myths we hold around people who are unhoused, and that prevents us from developing the kind of solutions that are possible today. So affordability, mindset. The other major issue is around the geography and the type of housing we're building. So we construct market rate housing projects in low-income neighborhoods, including low-income neighborhoods of color that have experienced historic racism, right? And there's a lack of fundamental understanding of market force displacement, that when you build market rate housing in low-income neighborhoods, that is at some point going to drive up rents for them, right? It's going to create market incentives for landlords to evict lower income tenants in order to be able to attract the new people who are coming into that neighborhood. And so there's a lot of state legislation around transit-oriented development that actually, without having strong anti-displacement protections, not understanding the role of market force displacement, actually can create great harm. The last point I would make is that we need to use our existing systems in the state of California. So the state of California requires all jurisdictions to do this thing called develop a housing element, which basically is your plan for the next 7 or so years around how you're meeting your housing needs of your local community. So, and government agencies spend a lot of money and hire consultants to develop these plans. And then there's no accountability, which makes no sense. So what if there was a system in place in California where there was accountability for jurisdictions to have to meet their plans, for state funding and federal funding to be made available for local jurisdictions to be able to follow and implement their local housing elements. Those systems currently exist in California. We just need to do a better job of making them work.
Thank you so much. Yes, accountability. We need that a lot in our government. Thank you so much. Now we're going to ask our audience if they have any questions. If you do, please raise your hand and please be succinct with your questions and comments. So limit it to 2 minutes. For those of you new to Zoom, the feature of raising your hand is found at the bottom of your screen under reactions. Any questions? Oh, Karen Beck, please ask your question.
Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah.
You're still on mute.
Ah. I'm having, there, how's that? Is that better?
Yes, fine.
Okay, I'm sorry. Technical difficulties, being an older person. I want to know, what do you think really needs to be done? What would you like to see happen as far as housing in California specifically?
Well, I think we have a paradigm we can follow, and that deals with, let's take the example, public education, right? What kind of systems do we have in place to make sure that every child goes through K to 12 education? What kind of funding do we have in place to ensure that happens? Now, of course, there are issues of equitable distribution of resources, but at least there is a system, a baseline to start from, right? What if there was a legal right to housing?
Okay.
You know, what if we actually entered the international human rights community and adopted some of the UN standards on housing and human rights and started to implement them? From my perspective, we have the resources we need to house everyone, right? But we're letting, we let this neoliberal thinking get in the way. We let the market dictate who gets housing, who doesn't get housing, right? Let's take housing, which is so fundamental to human survival, out of the equation of the market.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Ellen Nelson Larson. Ask your question.
She's muted too.
You need to unmute yourself, Ellen. Or Cecilia.
There we go. Yes, you had to unmute me, or somebody did. My question has to do more with housing in the suburbs as opposed to in core cities like Oakland and others around the country. And I know that the issue of redlining has been an issue for a long time, but I don't know how well we've dealt with it, both as a physical characteristic of I guess most of the houses in our community, and it's historic, and it's, I don't think, been removed when houses have been resold, but it has certainly contributed to the a mix, if you will, of pricing and house types of houses that have been built in non-urban communities. So I'm wondering if you thought about this and what kinds of suggestions you would have for addressing it as an issue.
Yes, Ellen, thank you so much for that question. It's very personal to me because I live in Contra Costa County. I got priced out of Alameda County when my family circumstances changed. And according to my grant deed, I'm not allowed to own my home.
Yeah.
Right. So
Right.
yes, very much so. There's this legacy of racism that still is in some of our even legal documents. You know, it's no longer legally enforceable, of course, but the remnants are there, and we see that not just in grant deeds, but we see that in who gets to live in certain parts of our the Bay Area itself, and who gets access to better public schools and so forth and so on. I think, you know, and I may offend people if I say this, and if I do, I apologize in advance. We have to do a better job of sharing our resources. There's land in the Bay Area. You know, there is land available to build the kind of housing to house families with children, to be able to go to great public schools, right? But we restrict people from being able to build the type of housing that they can afford. And so I think it takes, so as a former civil rights lawyer, I know that sometimes we need the laws to step in, to say to places where there's resistance that we have to do this because it's in the best interest of our society. It's how we live our values, our stated values, right? And also it takes the consciousness and the work of people who live in those communities who say, you know what, I'm ready to start sharing, right? I'm ready to talk to my neighbors about the need for us to, we've got acres and acres of vacant land. Let's build housing on those properties.
Thank you. Rick, I have a question.
No, I was just going to ask a follow-up if I could.
Oh, Ellen, okay, really quick.
What would you think if cities were encouraged to look at the use of land more as a resource management allocation issue rather than, what shall I say, a housing issue, if you will? I mean, certainly housing would be part of it, but rather than saying we're going to keep this percentage of houses for low income and this percentage for something else, look at it really as a resource allocation of property that could be used for various and sundry purposes, and try to set up criteria based on the values that they agree to that you've just talked about. And then open it up to developers and people who could bid based on those criteria that were developed for each of the different parcels of land that have been defined in the community that have not yet been utilized in any way.
So Ellen, are you?
But approaching it that way rather than looking at it from the point of view of, we need, instead of starting with low income housing, starting with resource management allocation and what makes our community work and what illustrates our values.
So yes, and that's called a general plan.
Yes.
That includes housing, environmental justice, open
Right.
space, parks, transportation, land use, right? And that is happening for California. A lot of our jurisdictions are in that general plan cycle right now. So absolutely, we have to plan comprehensively.
Yeah,
right?
part of what I see though is that in the general planning, and this is Danville's a good example of it, when communities are developed, and there's one that's being near completion, I guess, at the top of the junction of Bollinger Canyon Road and Crow Canyon, but up on top of the hill. I don't know what they've named the street now that gives you access to that property. And a very small percentage of that was allocated to low-income housing. Does that satisfy the needs of the community or of the potential growth of the community? I personally would doubt it. I mean, I haven't looked into it, so I don't know exactly what the.
Hey, Ellen, I'm sorry, but I think you're over the 2-minute mark and we already
Sorry.
questions. So I was just wondering, we have other speakers tonight. Would everyone feel comfortable if we move on to the other speakers and you keep your questions until the end of the other speakers? Would that be okay? Everybody give a thumbs up. Okay, why don't we move on? And thank you. Thank you, Margaretta, for being here.
Thanks so
Yes,
much.
and
sharing your-
if you have other follow-up questions, feel free to email me. I'm at margarettalyn@berkeley.edu.
Okay, thank you very much. We
Take
appreciate.
good care, everyone.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry, I didn't know there was a limit.
I said there was a limit. And Rick, would you like to introduce our second speaker?
I certainly would. Our second speaker for tonight is Laura Foote, and she is a key founder and executive director of YIMBY, YIMBY, which is a network of people who advocate for an abundant, affordable housing, also inclusive, sustainable communities across the United States. And she holds a BA in economics from Hamilton College and became a housing activist in 2014. Laura has grown the organization into a thriving grassroots political organization with thousands of volunteers. It has over 3,000 supporters nationwide and is made up of nearly 20 chapters in cities across the country. And we're very happy to have Laura here to speak to us tonight. Welcome, Laura.
Hey, everybody. And actually, Margaretta set me up really well because our big thing that we're working on right now is the housing element process that Margaretta was talking about, where the state sets housing goals and local communities have to update their general plan. So I'm really excited. I feel like the transition is going to be seamless.
Good.
So Richard, do you want me to just talk or did you want to tee up a question?
Well, yeah, go ahead and give us a little background of what you've been up to in this important endeavor.
Yeah, and also my dog Frank would like to say hello to all of you. Yes, he was on the floor barking throughout saying, please pick me up. So I'm picking him up in order to have him not disturb us tonight.
Doesn't he travel with you on the train as well?
He does. You follow Twitter or Instagram, yeah.
Heard about that.
So, yeah, so I do, YIMBY action. So we believe that one of the key problems that California is facing is a chronic housing shortage, where we don't have enough housing. We especially don't have enough housing near jobs and opportunity. We don't have enough low-income housing. We don't have enough every kind. If there's a kind of housing, we don't have enough of it. And how do we get more housing built, especially in these high opportunity neighborhoods? Part of it is about removing the barriers to that housing. So it's about changing our laws and saying we're going to allow housing to go into, and often cases, this is in, high income communities. So these are places where there are great schools, where there's a lot of opportunity, where there's a lot of jobs. How do we break down the barriers to opportunity and allow more people to live in those communities, allow that housing to get built? It also involves advocating for more funding for subsidized affordable housing. So we have these kind of 5 key factors that we think are going to lead to an abundant housing situation, where my rent personally goes down is also one of the goals. But we also reduce homelessness and, stop mega commuting. There are all these terrible consequences of having a chronic housing shortage as people are pushed out further and further away from the jobs and opportunity, and also down into poverty and into homelessness. So our goal is to have a lot of housing. So our kind of key principles are the zoning. We want to allow more housing on paper. We want to make it easier to build housing, especially in wealthy communities, especially subsidized affordable housing in communities that often say no to it. We want to streamline the permitting so that what we say in our general plans is actually what we allow to be built. A lot of, those community meetings where projects, we're tapping the brakes on a lot of housing, often well-intentioned, but it ends up with a chronic housing shortage. More money for subsidized affordable housing. We want the federal government and local governments to be spending more. We have so many resources that can be spent to just get more subsidized affordable and nonprofit and social housing built. We want to fix a lot of the bad incentives. Often when we talk about housing, it's important to also think about transportation. How are people going to get around in those communities? How are we going to make sure that we're doing transit and housing and having walkable, thriving communities, that we're moving away from car-centric infrastructure, but we're not leaving somebody on the end of a dirt road that they can't get out of that situation. And then lastly, tenant protections and things to increase tenant stability while we build more housing. So how do we do development without displacement? How do we have welcoming, inclusive communities? So that's kind of the sorry to go really fast on policy, but that's the big picture policy that we're fighting for, that then has a lot of, subsequent things. But what we do every day is organize local YIMBY groups, local chapters, members to be doing that advocacy in their communities. So when we say, yes, in my backyard, what that means to us is that people in their communities advocating for welcoming communities, for building more housing in their community, and also changing their laws in order to help us address the housing shortage. And so I want to do a shout out to our newest chapter, is actually in your backyard, is Evolve Tri-Valley, and Sean is here. So I want to shout out for them. They've got a nice little thriving already chapter of other advocates. And one of the other things, just because Margaretta set me up so well, the big thing that's happening right now in California is this housing system. By housing nerds, we call it RHNA, RHNA. Why is it called RHNA? I have no idea, but you pronounce RHNA as RHNA. And this is this process where the state recognizes we need a lot of housing. So the state does a lot of complicated math and they say, okay, here's our best guess at what the minimum housing production needs are in every community. And they also break it down by income level. So they do 4 brackets. They say, how much housing do you need at the super low income level? How much at the middle? There's upper middle and high income. And they give the regions big housing goals. Those housing goals get distributed to the cities. The cities then do this process where they figure out how they're going to meet those goals. They update their general plan. And so your city is like just starting this process of updating the general plan. They do a community outreach process. They talk to a lot of people about where are we going to put this housing? How are we going to meet these housing goals? They have a lot of the like really good, complicated conversations about how do we deal with the needs of our community. And, you know, different cities do it, you know, different levels of progressive, different levels of effort. And then they say to the state, okay, here's our plan. The state says, this plan is yes or no, this plan is garbage, and you know, you get an F, right? So the state can say, no, you have flunked, you have made a bad plan that is not going to achieve your housing goals that we've set out to you. And so there's a little bit of push and pull between the state and the local jurisdictions. You know, in some places, Beverly Hills, Cupertino, you see communities that, you know, do a lot of work to try to avoid building housing for their workforce. You know, Cupertino has huge Apple campus. They have so many jobs and opportunity there. And, you know, their city council is quite anti-housing. They are doing a lot of work to make sure that a dead mall does not become housing. Why is a sort of deeper psychology than I am really capable of going into, but they are very committed to, you know, not wanting to build a lot of housing in their community. And I think you can sort of go into all the reasons why they're housing skeptical, why they're afraid. I think there's a lot you can sort of get into there, but what it means is that the people who work in Cupertino don't necessarily live in Cupertino. You've got longer and longer commutes. You've got people complaining about traffic and about all of this process. The RHNA process is supposed to force cities like Cupertino to actually plan for the growth that we know is going to be happening. And I want to show my screen, if that's all right. Can I do that? So we've got this fun interactive tool. So we're running this campaign for fair housing elements, where one of the things that I think is really important for everyone to know, new state law, is that every city has to affirmatively further fair housing as part of their rezoning process. They have to say, how are we going to undo patterns of segregation in our community through our housing policies? And different cities are taking that. Yeah, I think that based on the values I've heard you guys express tonight, I think that that's like, if I was going to be like telling you what to do, which don't listen to me, I'm just here to to give some advice, but affirmatively furthering fair housing is a thing that like cities need to be taking really seriously. And there's a real opportunity to do serious work to undo these patterns of segregation. So you can go into our city dashboard here, and you can see your city and how well it did last cycle and what you guys need to do for this cycle. So what's a city that I should pick?
Danville.
Walnut Creek.
Not Walnut Creek, or Danville or San Ramon.
San Ramon, yeah.
Okay, I'm in the sands, so Elemento, San Ramon, here we go. All right, so your housing element is due in 458 days. You're on notice. And last time the goal was relatively low. It was 1,417. This time it's 5,111. You can do it. This is going to bring down housing costs. I'm really excited for you guys. So you can see how it breaks down by income level. We've also got more resources here that you can look up of, you know, what else we need to be doing, city council stuff. I'm sure you guys are relatively familiar with some of this stuff. We've got more resources on our website. But so far, fun for you guys. So you already have 4 volunteer watchdogs who are paying attention to this process. If any of you guys are like inspired by the level of nerdiness I have just displayed, if you want to become a housing element watchdog, it's on the website too. But this is going to be the, you know, the next big thing in housing politics across the state of California is cities updating their general plans in order to meet these now higher, because we know we're in a real dire housing shortage, these now higher housing goals. So I'll leave it there because I assume you guys will have lots of questions.
Could you show us Danville just real quick? I want to
Oh,
see
sure.
now that we
I love this tool. So yes, we can play with this all day. Danville. Okay, Danville. It's loading. Okay, same due date. Last time you had 557. This time it's 2,241. And bad news for you is that last time you were really naughty in Danville and you only achieved half of your quite low goal. So the state is going to be paying a bit more attention to the cities that have made very little progress in previous cycles.
thank you.
Yes. Cool. Should I leave this up or stop sharing? Or do we want to do another city?
No, you can move on to your rest of your talk. We just wanted to see Danville and San Ramon. That's all.
Awesome. So do you, Richard, I know you had some prepped questions for me, maybe around SB 9 and 10, or are there other things you wanted me to talk about?
Yes.
Well, I just had a question of my own, because I, as a young person, my wife and I got into below market housing in Palo Alto, which is of course very expensive and is crazy expensive now. But we qualified and we were just both kind of new to the workforce and it was perfect for us, but we were able to stay there for a few years and then move to the East Bay and San Ramon. But when you have these below market housing units set aside, do they continue to stay in that category? Are they required to? Because I know when we sold our place, it remained below market housing and somebody else who couldn't afford a more expensive one was able to get in. But is that always the case?
So in general, yes, but I also want to preface with affordable, subsidized, below market rate. There are so many different kinds of subsidized affordable housing. There are so many different ways in which we get different kinds of affordable and subsidized affordable housing. So I kind of want to break it into a few categories to give people a sort of big picture of when we're talking about, like, sometimes people say low income housing, but like that's not exactly technically correct because there's a lot of middle income in deed restricted house. So I'm going to do big picture. So one kind of housing that's very common is nonprofit subsidized affordable housing. Capital A affordable is often how people talk about it when they're saying affordable housing. So this is housing that is run by private nonprofits. I happen to be married to an executive director of, he's in the room right now, I don't know if he wants to pipe up, but Sam Moss, Mission Housing. So these are nonprofits that build and maintain subsidized affordable housing, and generally, like a big source of their revenue, their funding is from the federal government. So we have low-income housing tax credits is something you might have heard of, but also local governments help make these projects possible by finding land for them. And there's local, state, there's cap and trade money. Nonprofit affordable, capital A affordable housers pull in funding sources from a variety of sources in order to build a deed restricted. So that means you have to be a certain income level often, nonprofit affordable housing. And those projects generally stay affordable forever, but the federal government in its neoliberal infinite wisdom did across the country create incentive programs where sometimes there are for-profit entities running some of this housing that they only have to be low income for about 50 years. And then they become market rates after a really, long time, but it's 50 years in general. So it's not very common in California and like the Bay Area. A lot of these have, luckily, local governments have done a lot to make sure that those buildings stay affordable, but there is a small of this capital A affordable, which has become privatized over time. So that's one category. And was that complicated enough for you? Sorry. Category two. Category two is BMR, below market rates. So these are often, it's a newer concept that we're doing. It's not a very long-standing kind of affordable housing, but they are required housing that we put on market rate housing projects, requiring a new project to build some level of affordable housing. So it's not subsidized by the government. Technically, it's subsidized by the project. So the way that these BMR units come into existence is sometimes it is through state programs that allow a for-profit developer to build a little bit taller and a little bit denser if they build some of these BMR units, right? So that's like in order to get through the permitting process and get a little height and a little density to make the project pencil, the tax that the government takes is build some nonprofit, they're not nonprofit, but don't make a profit. But these BMR units in the building or off-site sometimes of the building. So the other way that those BMR units, so we have two kinds of like density bonus and then also just straight up inclusionary requirements. Those are the two technical terms. So density bonuses are, we're going to give you a little, you give us a little. And inclusionary requirements are just straight across the board. The local government says you have to build a certain amount BMR in this new building if you're going to build often it's more than 10 units. So it's important to sort of think about when we're thinking about inclusionary that you're asking a for-profit market rate developer to be maintaining lower income, but often it's middle income housing on site. So they don't come with wraparound services. They don't come with the kinds of things that in the nonprofit capital A affordable really do help people who are maybe going from homelessness into housing, or they don't come with food pantry, childcare. A lot of the capital A affordable has this wraparound services, are maybe targeted sometimes at deeper levels of affordability, that kind of stuff. So we've got capital A, we've got inclusionary requirement, BMR. And then the third category is things you've probably heard of, like Section 8 vouchers. And so that's when we give an individual money and they go out into the private market and try to find a landlord. And so that's kind of the third way that we get subsidized housing. And one of the things that I just want to highlight about Section 8 and housing vouchers, unfortunately, we do not in California nor anywhere across the country have any what's called source of income discrimination protection. So as a landlord, it is legal for you to say, I don't want your Section 8 voucher. And so Section 8 voucher holders are very vulnerable to being evicted by landlords who maybe are just being arbitrary and deciding they don't want those people in their building anymore, what have you. So one of the tenant protections that is really important that I think local governments, but what we really want is the state government to fight for is making source of income discrimination illegal. I hope that at least illustrated.
Well,
how
now I realized that it's not so simple. There's different categories. I thought it was like just one category, but it's very interesting. Brody, we got some more people that want to ask questions.
We're going to hold our questions because we've got two more speakers and then we'll.
Oh, okay.
But Laura, can you just give us just a few minutes about the legislation that has affected housing?
Yeah, so as you can see, so the big one that I think will be relevant for you all is some of the laws that have strengthened the RENA process. So the numbers are a little bit higher because they're better reflecting the actual needs of our communities. And also there's like my favorite piece, again, I mentioned, is affirmatively furthering fair housing. So this is something that is going to be hopefully really powerful as we do this housing element process, is that every city has to look at their housing and say, how are our land use laws perpetuating segregation? And in a lot of cases, that's probably we've made it illegal in wealthy communities to build low-income housing, right? That's a very straightforward way that we're perpetuating segregation, is by just saying you can't build that kind of housing over here where we happen to have a lot of resources. So this is one of the ways that I think we're really looking forward to enforcing affirmatively furthering fair housing.
I was
yeah.
wondering if you knew about like SB 9 or 10
Yeah.
and other legislation that's coming up.
So SB 9 is a bill that was passed this past year that has made it legal across the state, similar to recent accessory dwelling unit bills that have passed. So this makes it legal in most places for somebody who owns a single family home to divvy it up and build a duplex where that used to be. So, maybe rent it out, maybe to a family member. It also makes it legal for large lots to split that lot in half. So you can have 2 lots where you maybe used to have like sort of a, the idea is that a place like I'm currently in San Luis Obispo, and there's a lot of sprawling ranch homes that I think, if we cut the lot in half and built some 2-unit buildings there, you could walk around a little bit more easily. It's expensive. These are all soft touch ways to make communities build a little bit more housing. SB 10 is a little bit different. SB 10 makes it easier for a local government that wants to upzone to up to 10 units. It makes it easier for that local government to not have to do as much paperwork. The paperwork is something complicated called a CEQA report, so an environmental impact report. So it makes it easier for those cities that are already saying, we want to make it easier to build 9-unit, 10-unit buildings everywhere. It makes it a little bit less of a burden for that local government to actually do that process. Some people were saying that it legalizes 10-unit buildings everywhere. And, I'm the kind of person that would be for that, but that is not what the bill does. It just makes it easier for local governments that are already deciding to do that to actually do it. Other laws that are coming up, it's really hard to say what's going to be coming up next year. I think that it is likely that we will see more laws about the RENA process and wanting to make the RENA process. You can think about our recent land use laws at the state level in these kind of 2 broad categories. Category 1 is we're going to just say what the rules are. So accessory dwelling units and SB 9 are examples of, we're just going to say you can build a backyard cottage across the state. And so the state has just sort of decided backyard cottages are something we need and we want. And so we're just going to make sure that almost everywhere within reason, any homeowner can build a backyard cottage. And duplexes are similar to that we have such a bad housing shortage. The state's going to come in and say, these are our standards. This is the minimum. These are our standards. The second category is we're going to set a goal and you get the local control to decide how you're going to reach that goal. And that's what the RENA process is all about, is we're not going to say exactly what your rules have to be, but we're going to sort of put forward some goals and principles, and you're going to have a local conversation and decide how you're going to meet those goals. And I mean, for me, I just think we have a housing shortage. I don't really care which way we go about solving that problem. I know some people are very passionate about getting to decide though, like how you meet those goals locally. I would also say that local control means a local argument. So it's going to be interesting as cities pass housing elements across the state, those local communities are going to have fierce arguments. And I think that some people who maybe started out thinking they wanted local control are going to wish that the state had just sort of told them what to do, because they're going to have a lot of fights about how are we going to reach those goals. But, I think, we're sort of going in both directions where we think we have a housing shortage. They're two perfectly reasonable ways to go about solving it. And so we've been really deeply engaged in both of those solutions.
Thank you. And please hold any questions until the end. We now have our speaker. Our third speaker is Grover Wehman-Brown. He is the communications manager at East Bay Housing Organization. Grover earned an MA and PhD in communications from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for research on ending homelessness in the US. And we're glad to have Grover join us. Thank you, Grover.
Yeah, thank you, Brody. And thank you to Margaretta and Laura for giving such a deep and broad setup of policy that really fits well within a lot of what East Bay Housing Organizations, the organization that I work for, is working on right now. And so first, to share a little bit about EBHO, as we call it, East Bay Housing Organizations. We are a member-driven organization that works to preserve, protect, and create affordable housing opportunities for low-income communities in the East Bay. And we do that through education, advocacy, organizing, and building coalitions. Our members are made up of residents of affordable housing, staff members at public and nonprofit affordable housing providers, as Laura mentioned, with apparently her husband in the room, and also local advocates, like at one time myself and yourself, that are committed to building and creating just communities where everybody has a quality, stable, affordable home in the East. There's a mystery. Okay, and Brody asked me to share specific steps locally that people can take in ways that they can be engaged to increase affordable homes in the San Ramon Valley. And EBHO, as an organization that works in both Alameda and Contra County, we have options to share. And so I would like to share my screen. I came with 3 suggestions, and some of them have been posed. Let me just share here a little bit about EBHO and our values. And I want to say that at EBHO, we approach affordable housing from what is considered the 3 Ps, an integration of preserving affordable homes that already exist. For example, if somebody is living in a rental apartment and they can afford their rent, then can we put limits on how quickly rent can be increased? Or can we make it so that if their house is sold, somebody can't just evict them just because they want to charge more for rent, for example? Those are kind of tenant protections, policies that we advocate for over the long term to preserve people in the homes they have that are affordable, or to repair old crumbling housing that is affordable so that it's nice and quality and can remain affordable. And we also work and advocate for the production of new affordable homes that have community investment, as Laura mentioned, with our tax dollars, with our land, and by taxing people who are building homes that are really expensive in our communities and making a profit of that. And then I wanted to share, as you may know, in Contra Costa County and the state in general, we had strong eviction moratorium during the pandemic. And at the end of September, they were lifted at the state level and in Contra Costa County. They remain in place in Alameda County. So I know that your region straddles the border of, so there's different laws operating in different places, but what we know is beginning to happen, and unfortunately will, I fear, balloon over the next couple months, is that people will begin to be evicted that have unpaid rent from the pandemic or that fell on hard times during the pandemic for various reasons and cannot maintain their rent. And so in anticipation of that eviction cliff, as it was called, we worked with other advocacy organizations across Canada to recommend 8 essential actions that you, as someone in your local community that's an advocate, can go to your city council or to your county board of supervisors and advocate for, that will help stabilize people who are renters, or even in some cases homeowners that are low income in your communities, to ensure that people can stay housed. And so I believe I shared the link for this. This is the link I sent over this evening, but I can also share it at the end. Oh, you did it, Cecilia, thank you. So you can go and look at 8 actions, and that can be a starting toolkit for you to sit down with your fellow advocates and say, okay, let's look at what's happening in our community. You know, in Contra Costa County, there is a lot of immigrant communities, especially that are, you know, really at risk of eviction and already in some cases living in overcrowded conditions, or are experiencing harassment from landlords for unpaid rent, despite the fact that they might be eligible for rent relief and it just hasn't reached them yet. So one of the things that I wanted to highlight was the Fund for Legal Services. So Laura mentioned it, and then also Margaretta, of course, your work is rooted in part in lawyering, right, for the rights of people to remain housed. And what's true is that in eviction courts across the nation, landlords have lawyer representation. I believe the number is 89% of the time, and tenants, I believe their number is about 8% of the time. And what that results in is people getting evicted when perhaps there's not legal justification for it, but they don't have the legal representation to make the arguments, or sometimes they don't even show up because they're so afraid or they're so devastated, and also because most people that are experiencing eviction are also working, have children, right, have other things that are keeping them. So advocating for increased legal services is something that could be really important right now, because people could be in rental apartments and eligible for rent relief, which would then prevent them from being evicted, but they might not be able to make that argument in court. And next, I wanted to piggyback on this broad conversation about housing elements, really in some ways, maybe one of my favorite ones I've been to in a while, in that Margaretta started answering a great question that somebody asked about how do we, what if we allocated resources, is I think what the question asker was getting at. And then Margaretta said, well, that's your general plan. And sometimes it's difficult to really understand how these, I think of them as wonky policy and technocratic processes that happen at the city level because the state tells them to, right? How that can really build the future that we long for. And so this picture that you have here is a picture that was created after we had a meeting of our members that we brought together, and we all did a reflection exercise together about what would it look like in the East Bay if we really won the campaigns that we long for. And as people were sharing back, a graphic illustrator took these graphic notes, and this was the result of it. And so this shows hopefully in picture form, what you could help advocate for with the housing element by saying, actually, I want to live in a place that the built environment is not shaped by racism anymore. What would my neighborhood look like if segregation wasn't the primary thing dictating who gets to live there and not, right? What would my neighborhood look like if we had systems that support as opposed to harm built within my community here in San Ramon, right? What if my family is fallen on hard times? Where would we go? And would that be an affirming place to go? And so at EBHO, we have been working for a long time, 36 years, I believe. And part of the work is advocating for affirmatively furthering fair housing, which, as Laura mentioned, including affordable housing in communities that are generally pretty high wealth. And the San Ramon Valley is one example, and that is part of what's important about this next housing element cycle is when it's written, and then in the 10 years that the city is continuing to make decisions about where housing is built and where your tax dollars are spent, really articulating in the general plan and then continuing to track through the meetings year after year, is the city meeting its goals to create the number of affordable homes, and especially the deeply affordable homes that are needed in the community. So I looked at the numbers quickly before we came, but the number of homes that are affordable to low-income people that are being asked in this regional housing needs allocation for San Ramon and Danville are more than 4,000. And those are homes that are affordable to, for example, low income, so I think of it as the middle tier, is affordable to somebody who earns $68,500 a year and has a family of 4. And then extremely low income is, for example, a single person, like an elder who makes less than $28,800 a year, which is a lot of elders that are living on Social Security. And is part of why there's so many unhoused Black elders when combined with displacement, as Margaretta was talking about, living on our streets in Oakland right now. But that's not the economic devastation in housing isn't limited to people in Oakland, as I'm sure you see on your highways and throughout your communities. And so advocating for affordable homes for extremely low income people in your general plan is really important. And then also doing the work to show up to city council meetings year after year and tracking what's happening in planning. And also I wanted to say that EBHO has created a housing element working group made up of our members that are doing this advocacy and meeting together to share tips specifically about how to advocate for affirmatively furthering fair housing and making sure the considerations that need to happen about affordable housing for low-income people, including because so many people with disabilities are also low income, like are we planning for enough units that are accessible to people who use wheelchairs, right? That is also part of planning for low-income affordable housing. And we can put it in the chat, but we have a post about our housing element working group, and you can get in touch with our policy director, Jeff Levin, to join that group. And currently we have members that are working on the housing element in Alameda, Berkeley, Concord, El Cerrito, Fremont, Lafayette, and Pleasanton, Dublin. But we'd love to have you as well. And finally, I want to lift up the resources that you already have available to you that you can advocate for your city to use to really contribute to affordable homes in your community. And recently, in 2019, we passed updates to the Surplus Land Act that now requires when a local agency like your sewer district or your school district, if your city manager has determined that the land is no longer useful and you want to sell it or discharge it, as the word is, that first it has to be declared surplus and made available for affordable housing to be negotiated on that land for a price, right? For a lease price or a purchase price, but so that affordable housing providers actually have the ability to invest and build in communities using the resource and not trying to go head to head with market rate developers who have literally more resources to bid higher and higher for pieces of land. So this is a surplus land act. It is now law. And we have, we can share the link in the chat, but we partnered with the, with public advocates and the public interest law group to create this flow chart that city staff can use, or also that if you're a local advocate who's really on it, you can also just stick up next to your desk. And anytime you're thinking, oh, at city council, they're selling off that parcel of land, I wonder if it went through the Surplus Land Act correctly. So a little tracking document to track it. And we also are involved in public land advocacy to ensure affordable homes are on BART station land. And BART created a policy that they have 35% across the system, but that's something that when that comes up in your community, you can call in and say, yes, I love this. I think that having affordable homes at the BART station near me is a really great use of our land. It makes it walkable to get on BART and to head wherever you want to go without having a car if need be. And so that's an overview of, I think, 3 specific things that you could get involved in. And you can join EBHO as a member, join our email list to stay up to date on these campaigns that we're working on. And also feel free to reach out to me, grover@ebho.org, if you have questions. And on November 10th, we're having our annual membership meeting and celebration. And so I'm also gonna invite you to join me at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Grover. And we'll have our questions after our next speaker is Alfred Tu. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes.
Oh, good. And Alfred works as an architect, having received his degree in architecture from UC Berkeley. He's been a housing activist, and in 2018, he actually ran for the Berkeley City Council on a platform of creating new housing and expanding tenant protections. He is on the board of the California Democratic Renters Council, and he served on the board of the East Bay Young Democrats, who we know. So thank you, Alfred, for being here tonight.
All right. Thank you for the invite. So as we are heading into the 2022, which is an election year, one thing to think about is what might be some local ballot measures you can run to fund housing in your cities. So I will go over a few examples from some of the areas around here. Right. You all see the screen? Great. So as far as funding goes, there's always the general tax revenue option, though there's so many things competing for funding that it can be hard. At the state level, we have cap and trade funding for affordable housing that comes from taxes on carbon emissions, and it's used to build homes near mass transit. At the local level, there are a few different taxes that are relatively easy to pass because they don't affect most people. And they include taxes on landlords, taxes on people selling property, and taxes on developers, both residential and commercial. And then more recently, there's also this idea of social housing, which involves the government building housing directly and having the rich residents cross-subsidize the rest of them. So let's first look at the different local tax options that you could put on your ballot. So in Berkeley, 5 years ago, we passed what was called Measure U1. It was an increase on the business license tax for landlords. The way you look at it is a lot of cities have business taxes. If you run a store, if you run a restaurant, you pay a business tax. Being a landlord is also a type of business. And so in Berkeley, we were able to pass a tax, which is 2.88% of rent collected. In East Palo Alto, they had something similar, which was 1.5%. And both of these had two key provisions in them. The first exception was that if you own less than 5 apartments, it didn't apply to you. And so, for example, if you're a homeowner and you have your house and then it's a duplex, so there's another unit that you're renting out, that doesn't affect you. It's mostly for the big landlords. And then these ballot measures were also written so that they didn't apply to new buildings until they got a little bit older. And the idea here is that with the new buildings, they're still paying off the cost of construction. And so we didn't want to tax them too hard, because then otherwise they might not get built at all. And so both Berkeley and Palo Alto said this tax only applies to buildings after they turn either 10 or 12. Both of these passed by very large margins. In Berkeley, we got, I think, around 3/4 of the vote, even though the landlords spent well over $1 million and was the most expensive campaign in our city's history. Because at the end of the day, the tax only affected at most a couple percentage points of the entire city. Tenants didn't pay this, your average homeowner didn't pay this, even small landlords didn't pay this. So business license taxes are a good way for a steady stream of funding that you can use for affordable housing. The other one is taxing property sales. The way I like to think about this is that transfer taxes are sales taxes on real estate. If I were to go to a used bookstore and buy a book, I would pay sales taxes of about 8 to 10%, depending on what city I'm in. However, if I were to buy a used building, the taxes are much lower. In some places, they're only about 1%. And so the idea of transfer taxes for affordable housing is to address this unfairness and also provide a source of funding that can be used for housing, and also to discourage the flipping and speculation that can drive up the prices of housing in an area. So here are examples from Berkeley, Oakland, Culver City, and San Francisco. And one thing you'll find in all 4 cities is that just like federal income taxes or state income taxes, this is structured as a progressive tax, where the more money you make, the higher rate you pay. And typically the cutoffs are around $1 to $2 million, because that's a level at which we're talking about commercial buildings, apartment buildings, mansions. And so again, this tax is written so that it doesn't affect your average homeowner. And so in Berkeley, we were able to bump up from 1.5 to 2.5% for property worth over $1.5 million. And then once again, this is only paid when people sell. If you love the town you live in and you don't plan on leaving, you will never pay this tax. If you leave your home to your kids, you will never pay this tax. And in Culver City and San Francisco, they were, for the largest of properties, which is usually things like office buildings, large apartment complexes, they were able to get up to 4 to 6% of the property sales going into their housing funds. And that's a big deal. Let's say you have a large apartment complex with a couple hundred apartments. That building gets sold for $100 million. If your city has a good property transfer tax, you could be bringing in a few $1,000,000 just like that. You don't even have to do anything. And again, because this is a tax that the vast majority of residents will never pay, it was relatively easy to get these passed as well. Finally, there is taxing buildings when they're being built. And for residential buildings, it's called either the Affordable Housing Impact Fee or the inclusionary housing. And there are a couple of goals here. One of them is to bring in funding for housing, and the other is also to create communities where you have both rich people, middle class, and poor people living together in the same building. And the percentages are typically set anywhere from 5% to San Francisco is the highest at 26%. They're able to go a bit higher than most places because their rents are so high, so they're able to support a bigger subsidy. And this is an important point because one thing you want to do with setting these inclusionary housing percentages is to coordinate with surrounding cities, because the situation you want to avoid is if city 1 raises the percentage that's required, and then all the developers just go build in city number 2 instead. And so ideally, this is something you coordinate with your neighboring cities when adjusting. There is talk about a statewide inclusionary housing requirement legislation in the future. It hasn't been introduced yet. We'll see how it goes. What the state does have is they have a couple of voluntary programs. A couple of the earlier speakers touched on this, where in exchange for providing low-income housing, a building can be built either larger or faster. And the last point I want to make on inclusionary housing is it's important that it's written to apply to everything, even a house that's being built. Obviously, you can't have 10% of a house be low income, but what cities do is that there's also an option to pay a fee instead of actually providing the unit. Because in places where there's an exemption on smaller buildings like Berkeley and San Francisco, we've seen a lot of projects just stuck under that limit. And that encourages them to build buildings that have larger, more expensive homes in them instead of a greater number of more modestly priced homes, which is not what we want to happen. So if you're thinking of an inclusionary housing ordinance, make sure it applies to everything 1 unit and up. And the other way of taxing development is on commercial development, because that's really what's driving this whole housing crisis. Is there are all these jobs being created, but nowhere for people to live. And so what cities have done is they've created what's called the Jobs Housing Linkage Fee, which links a new office building to funding for affordable housing. Again, there's a wide range of rates. Most of cities are around the $5 to $15 per square foot range. San Francisco, because they're San Francisco, they charge up to $72 per square foot for office buildings that goes straight into their affordable housing fund. And finally, I want to talk about a way to get your affordable housing funding to go further, and that's called the Affordable Housing Overlay Zoning. This idea was first done in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Councilmember Terry Taplin is working on bringing it to Berkeley. And what it says is that if you are building affordable housing in your city, you can build apartments in places that you otherwise might not be able to. And you can also, in places where you can already build apartments, you can build them larger. And why this is really important is in a lot of our more lower density neighborhoods, even though it's mostly houses, there will also be churches, other kinds of more institutional uses, and frequently they will have surplus land, whether it's vacant land or a parking lot. And we found that a lot of these places are quite suitable for affordable housing, but currently is not possible because of the zoning. The affordable housing overlay allows them to be used for affordable housing without having to open it up entirely for all kinds of development. And this also means that when the housing nonprofits are purchasing land, they have more options to choose from, and they're not competing with the private developers. And so they're able to get more for their money. So these are all different options you can consider. Some of these can be passed at the city council level. The taxes have to go to the ballot. So now is a good time to start thinking about that for the 2022 election. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really informative. I'm going to open up for questions now. Remember, limit is 2 minutes. Raise your hand if you have a question for, I guess we have Alfred and Grover here to answer your questions. Okay, we have a question from Jenny Hooper. Please ask your question.
Hi, my question is what teeth are in the requirements for cities like Danville to build? I think our number was 5,000 affordable units, which seems to me to be an enormous goal for a place like Danville. So what teeth are in the legislation that will require that?
So I can answer that unless you want to go.
Go for it.
No, go for it, yeah.
So several years ago, state legislature realized that a lot of cities were not meeting their goals and had no intention to do so. And so a bill was passed called Senate Bill 35, SB 35. And what that says is that if a city or a county has been told that this is their housing goal and they're not meeting it, then projects that contain certain percentage of affordable housing can be approved in 6 months instead of having to go through a lengthy public hearing process. And there are two different tiers for SB 35. If a city is not producing enough low-income housing, but has built enough high-income housing, in that case, a project has to have at least 50% low-income housing in order to be streamlined under SB 35. If a city has failed to build enough housing at all income levels, then a project only needs 10% to be low income to be eligible for the SB 35 streamlining. That is the main teeth for making sure that cities actually follow through on meeting their housing goals.
Quick follow-up, if I may. Where has this been effective?
So we have the biggest example, SB 35. There are two main examples. In San Francisco, a lot of affordable housing nonprofits have been using SB 35 to get their projects built. The other high-profile case is in Cupertino, where they have a old shopping center that's been closed for a few years. And the developer is planning to build a mixed project that contains some office space and then 2,400 apartments, which would be, of which 1,200 would be low-income affordable. It would be the largest low-income housing in Silicon Valley. And this is in a city that has built less than 100 homes a year over the last several years.
I also am going to share a link in the chat about a new accountability office that was created because of legislation that was passed recently. And so we're hopeful that, you know, by saying, actually, if you're not meeting your housing element, then we're not gonna, you know, give you this transportation funding, for example, are the kinds of steps that will increase adherence.
You're,
Yeah, we saw from Laura's showing us her website, Danville had not met what 50% of its housing need last time. So does that mean that when they build houses in the future, 50% have to be affordable? Is that how that translates to, or not?
No, what that means is that if a project comes in and at least 50% are affordable low income, then that project can get approved much quicker.
Oh,
A project that's fully private, that one will still have to go through your regular public hearings and other reviews.
I see. Okay.
Brody, were you asking if, because like what will happen now that Danville didn't meet their goal?
Right. Where's the teeth? As Jenny was asking, how, you know, what do we do?
Well, I think Alfred can answer this better than me because I believe that Alfred was on the committee that, were you on that decided arena numbers in part, but I believe that unmet goal was considered in the allocations that were made for this next cycle.
Right, that was also part of it.
Okay, but then it's not making them do it. It's just saying you have to do it. You know,
Right, basically, it's saying that if you're not doing it and somebody comes in and wants to help you get there, you have to say yes.
okay.
Right.
If
The mandate doesn't come with funding, which is actually one of the issues, is that it's an unfunded mandate.
Okay.
But that's why I brought up all of these examples of the local funding. It's because there is state money and federal money out there, but it's often set up as a matching fund, and it's often competitive. And so the more that a local government can bring to the table, the more federal and state funding they can also get.
Okay, thank you. Sean, I have a question.
Well, I guess it's more of a comment. I just wanted to clarify that, you know, the regional housing needs assessment process is really a planning process. So cities have to make plans for housing, but they don't actually build it, right? So part of the accountability in it is also when a landowner goes to build something according to the city's plan, if the city says no, and it objectively meets the plan, they have grounds to bring it to court. And we've seen examples where cities have lost their approval authority for a period of time in certain areas because they weren't following their plan. They are required to have a compliant plan, a compliant housing element by state law, and they have to follow that plan. So I think that, as they mentioned, with the Housing Accountability Unit coming online in this next 8-year RHNA cycle, when cities go to submit their housing elements to HCD for review, I suspect this time around they're going to be a little bit more forceful about ensuring that they've followed a very earnest planning process in picking where they're going to put housing in their jurisdiction.
Thank you, Sean. That explains a lot. Yeah. Other questions? We had some questions earlier, Valerie.
I want to know how we turn NIMBYs into YIMBYs. I work with the homeless community. I go out every day into the encampments. They are a huge stain on our state. We see every day that we have, you know, a housing crisis, and yet we can't seem to grapple with it. Even in my community in Pleasant Hill, you can have a development of 8 houses and you will get a whole neighborhood out there opposing housing. They have their children who are moving out of state to buy affordable housing, and yet still we go out and protest housing development. How do we grapple with this? And we are a blue state. I believe NIMBYism crosses both party lines. How do we solve this?
I don't have a silver bullet answer, but, and although I study communications and I came into my work 15 years ago, like how do we get America to care about homelessness and to really reckon with it and change our country so that everybody is as offended by homelessness as we should be? And my answer to you today is that we need to change political power so that NIMBYs actually can't block housing development, right? So that win political power so that we actually have the funds we need to create homes that are affordable to people who are currently living in an encampment, right? Like we have to win politically, which is very different than sitting at a coffee shop and trying to convince your neighbor to think or feel differently. I think that work is also important to try. Like I worked on a campaign here. I live in the city of Alameda to try. We had to vote on whether or not a service facility for medically fragile seniors could exist in land that was already federally owned and gifted for this purpose, right? We voted on it. We continue to fight at city council meetings about it. And in that campaign, talking to people from my kids' school who were like, I just don't want that there because my kids walk by it. There were some people that I could convince to vote differently, but that's a lot of time spent. They shouldn't get to vote on it at all, right?
Yeah, one thing I would say is that this is one of those issues where there's a silent majority that every time you see these community meetings, there'll be a couple dozen people who show up and say no. But then there are hundreds and thousands of other people who are okay with it. They don't bother to show up because they don't see why. They have other things going on in their lives. Often they are younger, so they might still be working and so on. And I think it's important to just remind your elected officials that if you are in favor of housing, to make sure they hear about it so that they know that, oh yeah, there's actually a lot of people who are voting for me and want more homes. And to get into a more real technical thing, if your city has district-based elections, it's important to think about how those district lines are drawn, because we know that homeowners vote at higher rates than renters, and often a lot of renters are immigrants, and so they can't vote yet. And therefore, it's important to make sure that districts are drawn so that renters are able to elect somebody from their community.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. Do we have any more questions? We can include homelessness if that's what people are interested in. Well, I don't see any other questions. I guess it's getting a little bit late, but I want to thank our speakers, Grover and Alfred. Thank you so much for being here and talking to us. I appreciate your time. You did a great job.
Excellent. Everybody did a great job.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We don't have any meetings in November, December. Oh wait, do we have? Oh, that's a hand clapping. Okay, I thought it might be a question.
Actually, Brody, I do have one question.
Of course, Jenny. Yes, please.
Grover, the picture behind you looks to me like a program I saw on television called Grand Design, in which it talked about a housing development. It was in England, and it looked very much like the picture that's behind you, but it was all subsidized housing. So I was curious about the picture that's behind you. Is that a particular place?
It is, but it's not in England. It's in Pleasanton. And it is community subsidized affordable homes, I believe, for people with disabilities. And it is a home that was created by Saha, and I believe it's called the Sunflower at Irby Ranch. And we actually, if you'll give me a moment, I have a link to a full description of how it came to be on our website, and I will share it with you happily.
It's nice to know it's somewhere in our world.
That's right. It's somewhere you could visit. Here we go. So if you scroll on down this page, you will find a description of the advocacy organization that helped bring this to fruition, so that people with disabilities could stay living in Pleasanton in their own affordable homes.
How did Pleasanton get the money to build that? I mean,
it's in the description. You'll have to look at it, because as was described, almost all affordable housing that is built with a wide variety of financial sources. And so it is in the description that we provide here on our property profiles.
where's the best place to get grants for this kind of housing, for affordable housing?
Oh, it's very complicated. I'll tell you, like, there's no one stop. It's a very complicated thing that is, you know, some people, that's just what they do as their profession. And I mean, Alfred gave a really great overview of all the different ways that funds come down, and then it's people's jobs to collect them by applying for grants.
Well, I know, and everyone mentioned grants, and I just thought, what agencies do you go, what organizations do you go to get grants? I guess a lot of them, different ones, but still, can you mention a few? Does anyone know? Alfred?
Brody, I'm sorry, go ahead, Alfred.
Sean.
I was going to say one of the biggest sources for a lot of these projects is what's called the Low Income Tax Credit Program. And it's actually a federal program. And these tax credits are kind of like bartered and sold, and that allows them, these nonprofit developers, to leverage funding to build their projects. And then, you know, as Laura was mentioning earlier, there's a number of different sources for affordable housing. In Dublin, for example, we have a pretty robust inclusionary zoning ordinance fund that we collected money from all of our new development. And we collected that up over the years, and that's allowed us to do a number of projects, affordable housing projects. So that's called IZO, or inclusionary zoning ordinance funds. And, you know, then in Alameda County, we have bond funding, and, you know, you guys don't have that in Contra Costa County right now, but maybe that might be something that, you know, the citizens in Contra Costa might decide to pass, is to do an affordable housing bond. Ours is called the A1 Bond Fund, and that has injected, Alfred, do you know what the total dollar amount is? It's a lot. It's hundreds of millions of dollars.
I don't remember, but it's big. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of different ways. And yeah, it is very complicated. Brody, you know Iman Novin, right? He ran in Walnut Creek for city council. That's like what he does. He does affordable housing, like brokering and financing deals. It's very complicated.
What was his name?
Iman Novin. He ran for city council in Walnut Creek.
Yes.
Yeah, good guy.
Oh, okay.
And there are a lot of different state funds that are run through the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'll put the link to that here in the chat.
And those are state what? State funds?
Right. Mhm. So these are state funds, like I mentioned before. Usually projects will take local funds and then match them with the state funds.
Ah, matching funds from the state and the well, how much, I wonder how much the state allows for those kind of funds. What's their budget? Do we know?
So it depends on the project size. Typically, with affordable housing, you need a building to have at least about 30 to 50 homes just to get the economy of scale. And then usually those projects get up to about 100 to 200 homes at most, beyond which they become so big it's hard to get enough funding. So there's kind of a sweet spot, which is about 100 homes on half a block. That's with your typical 5-story building, or in the suburbs, it might be a larger 2-story complex. But that's a good size to be thinking about. And usually the local government will bring maybe about a quarter to a third of the funding. And then the rest will come from these state funding sources or the state and federal tax credits.
Okay. I was reading in a newspaper about tiny homes. I think they do it in San Leandro. I'm not sure where else. And they're really, really tiny. They might be like one room, that's your living room, bedroom, and you have a small kitchen and bathroom, and it's very tiny. But and they had, I don't know, I forget how many people that they had built these for. Not a whole lot, but they found out that the homeless people that were able to be in a tiny home, eventually 70% of the people were able to get a job. And then, you know, save money and move out. And it was I don't know, is that being done any place else? Do you know?
Yeah, so in California, the first big city to do tiny homes was Fresno. And then more recently in San Jose, has been pretty good about allowing tiny homes, and also by having pre-approved plans for the backyard cottages, the accessory dwelling units. And one of the things with these small tiny homes or ADU projects is that because they're so small, the paperwork costs can be a huge percentage of the actual cost of the building. And so anything that cities can do to simplify that, it basically is more possible. You know, with San Jose, they've been able to get it done where you can go to their permit office, pick out one of their pre-approved designs, and they'll give you your permit right there.
Did you say, but there is a lot of paperwork that you have to go through?
In most cities there is, but there are some cities that do what they call the pre-approved plans. And I'll put the link for this San Jose example also.
Oh, okay. Does San Francisco not do it just because they don't have the land to do it?
Right, San Francisco is a bit unusual in that nothing's standard there.
Yeah. Okay.
But the pre-approved buildings, they work great for the suburban areas. If you look at the history of housing, the most successful large-scale affordable housing system in this country is mobile homes. And that's because they were able to be mass-produced, brought from one place to another. So if you have a construction worker shortage, it's not such a huge issue. And tiny homes are sort of the modern version of that.
Yeah, okay. Jenny, we'd like to hear from you again.
I think there are a couple of small tiny home projects in Oakland. I've read about them in the newspaper. They're pretty small. They're only maybe 35 units or 40 units. And I think I read fairly recently that there was another one that was they were trying to put in some city-owned property that was a parking lot or something like that. So there's some small efforts there too.
Yeah, oh, good.
Yeah, I'll share a link in the chat, but recently youth artwork, Youth Spirit Artworks collaborated with faith communities to create a tiny home village for unhoused young people who led the design process. And that is at the top of this link that I just shared that also has the Irby Ranch project. So you can take a read through this part of our webpage, and it'll give you an overview of how different types of affordable homes, including a tiny home project all the way to many thousands of apartments on a city block, were created, and the funding source, and a little bit of a description about how it came to be, whether it was public land, or in the case of the tiny house empowerment village, there was a lot of NIMBYism in Berkeley, and so they ended up using a lot in Oakland.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Grover.
And with that, I actually have to go because I have to go put my children to sleep. But I really appreciate all of you. And I hope that you stay in touch with EBHO and that you have lots of success in creating affordable homes in your region.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Ginny, is that a new question? Your hand's up, or was that from previous times?
No, I don't know how to put my hand down.
There you go. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again for our speakers. That was wonderful to hear. You can tell we're not very knowledgeable about this, so you've increased our knowledge a lot, and we appreciate your time. So thank you so much to Alfred's only here. That was Grover before, who was leaving. Okay, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Keep in touch with our SRVDC emails, and we'll still be updating you about events that are going on locally, but we won't have a meeting until next January. So thank you so much for joining us.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Yes.
All right.
Great job, Brody.
Happy holidays.
Good meeting, everyone. Thanks, Brody.
Thank you.